Sarah Hayes had learned early in life that nothing came easy. At 27, she was used to moving from one temporary job to another, never staying long enough to feel secure. The weight of unpaid bills and the uncertainty of tomorrow had become familiar companions. As she walked through the crowded streets of New York, her fingers tightened around the strap of her worn-out bag. The email she had received that morning played over and over in her mind. A job interview for a nanny position at the Lancaster estate. She knew the name. Everyone did. The Lancasters were old money, an empire built on real estate and power. Sarah had never been near that kind of world. She had grown up in a very different place, a small, overcrowded orphanage on the outskirts of the city. Flashback, the orphanage. The scent of musty books and overcooked meals filled the air of St. Mary's Home for Girls. Sarah had spent her childhood here, surrounded by other children who, like her, had no one waiting for them. She had been 5 years old when her mother died. The details of that night were hazy. An accident, people had said, but even as a child, Sarah had sensed that there was more to the story. The most painful part wasn't losing her mother. It was losing her father, too. He had vanished. No explanation, no goodbye. One day he was there, holding her hand, whispering that everything would be okay. The next, he was gone. She had spent years hoping, waiting for him to return, but he never did. Present day. Sarah shook off the memory as she reached the towering gates of the Lancaster estate. She hesitated for a brief moment before pressing the intercom. A crisp voice responded almost immediately. "Miss Hayes?" "Yes," she answered, clearing her throat. The gates opened without another word, and she stepped inside. Looking up at the grand mansion, its cold, elegant exterior sent a shiver down her spine. This was a different world, one she did not belong to. But as she took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, she had no idea how much this place would change her life forever. The moment Serafina stepped into the Lancaster mansion, she felt it, a silence so deep it was almost suffocating. The house was grand, breathtaking even, but it was the kind of beauty that felt untouchable. The towering ceilings, pristine marble floors, and dimly lit chandeliers created an atmosphere of calculated perfection. Yet, despite the luxury, there was no warmth. A woman in a tailored black suit approached her with an expression that was neither welcoming nor unkind. "You must be Miss Hayes," she said. "I'm Margaret, the house manager." "Follow me." Sarah nodded, gripping her bag a little tighter. She had expected the formality, but something about the house made her feel like an intruder, as if she had entered a world that wasn't meant to be touched by outsiders. As she walked through the hallways, she noticed the lack of personal touches. No family pictures, no scattered belongings. It felt more like a museum than a home. Then, suddenly, laughter. The sound echoed down the hall, light and unrestrained, breaking through the heavy silence. Margaret stopped in front of a playroom and knocked twice before opening the door. Inside, Elara Lancaster, a small girl with wild curls, sat on the floor surrounded by stuffed animals. She looked up with wide, curious eyes before breaking into a shy smile. "This is Elara," Margaret introduced. Elara tilted her head. "Are you my new nanny?" Sarah crouched to her level. "I hope so. Do you think we'll get along?" The little girl studied her for a moment before nodding. "You don't look scary." Before Sarah could respond, a boy's voice came from the corner. "She hasn't met our dad yet." Sarah turned to see Finn, a boy of about 10, sitting by the window with a book in his hands. He didn't look up as he spoke, but his tone carried something older than his years, something edged with quiet observation. Margaret cleared her throat. "The children's father will meet you shortly." As if on cue, a deep voice resonated from the doorway. "Miss Hayes." Sarah turned. Standing there was Ambrose Lancaster. Sharp suit, unreadable expression, and a presence that made the air in the room shift. Their eyes met for the first time, and something unspoken flickered between them. Tension, curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite name. Sarah had only been in the Lancaster mansion for a few days, but she could already sense the invisible walls built around the children. Elara clung to her quickly, always reaching for her hand, always seeking her presence. She was a child starved for affection, desperate for warmth in a house that provided everything except that. Finn, on the other hand, was different. He was polite but distant, as if he had learned that trusting adults only led to disappointment. He observed her carefully, measuring her responses, waiting to see if she would be like the others. Temporary, distant, uninterested. One evening, as Sarah helped Alara with a puzzle in the playroom, Finn sat by the bookshelf, flipping through a novel but not really reading it. The silence between them felt heavy, filled with words neither knew how to say. "You know, you don't have to be nice to us just because it's your job," Finn said, not looking up from his book. Sarah studied him for a moment. "And what if I want to?" Finn's fingers tightened around the pages. "Then you'll probably leave, just like the rest." His words carried the weight of abandonment. It wasn't just nannies who had left. It was their father, too. Not physically, but emotionally. Before Sarah could respond, Alara spoke up. "Finn doesn't like to talk about feelings," she whispered, as if it were a secret. "But he does like hot chocolate." Sarah smiled. Noted. Later that night, as Sarah made her way down the hall, she overheard Ambrose speaking in low, measured tones in his office. She wasn't eavesdropping, at least, not intentionally, but something about his voice made her pause. "I don't need a lecture, Julius," Ambrose said. Julius McCall, the Lancaster family lawyer, responded with practiced calm. "You hired a nanny, Ambrose, not a disruption." Sarah's pulse quickened. "She's here for the children." "That's all," Ambrose said, though his tone held something restrained, something unresolved. Julius sighed. "She's asking questions. You need to keep her in her place." Sarah forced herself to keep walking, her heart pounding. What questions? She hadn't asked anything, at least not aloud. But as she moved through the cold, empty halls, she realized something unsettling. She wasn't the only one in this house keeping secrets. The storm rolled in faster than expected. One moment, the sky above the Lancaster estate was a quiet stretch of gray, and the next, it was alive with streaks of lightning and the low growl of thunder. Sarah had just finished tucking Alara into bed when the first crack of thunder rattled the windows. Almost immediately, a sharp cry came from the little girl's room. Sarah rushed back in to find Alara curled up beneath the blankets, her small body trembling. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling beside the bed. "It's just a storm. You're safe." Alara clung to her. "I don't like the noise. It's too big." Sarah brushed a hand over her curls, humming softly. "Want me to stay until it passes?" The little girl nodded against her shoulder. A shadow crossed the doorway. Ambrose, dressed in his usual dark suit, though the tie was missing, he looked slightly disheveled, like he hadn't been expecting to be pulled from whatever work consumed him at this hour. His sharp eyes flickered from Sarah to Alara. "What's wrong?" His voice was low, edged with impatience, though Sarah suspected it wasn't meant for them. "The storm scared her," Sarah explained softly. "She just needs a little comfort." Alara lifted her head, watching her father with hesitant eyes. She didn't reach for him, and he didn't move toward her. A beat of silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. "There's nothing to be afraid of, Alara," he said, but his voice lacked warmth. "You're safe inside." Sarah bit the inside of her cheek. That wasn't what the little girl needed to hear. She adjusted the blanket around Alara, keeping her voice gentle. "Sometimes, even when we know we're safe, we still feel scared. And that's okay." She wasn't expecting Ambrose to react, but for a split second, his gaze softened, just barely. Then, just as quickly, his mask returned. Another loud crash of thunder made Alara yelp and grab onto Sarah's hand. The sudden movement sent Sarah off balance, and she reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against something solid and warm. Ambrose. The moment their skin touched, time seemed to freeze. It was brief, a flicker of warmth, a current of something neither acknowledged. But Sarah felt it, and by the way Ambrose tensed, she knew he did too. He pulled away first, stepping back as if burned. His expression hardened, walls slamming back into place. "Good night, Miss Hayes," he said curtly before turning on his heel and disappearing down the hall. Sarah sat there, heart racing, utterly confused. The Lancaster mansion was vast, But there were places that felt particularly forbidden. Sarah had grown used to the cold, impersonal feel of the house. Yet certain doors carried an unmistakable weight, doors that weren't just closed, but sealed with unspoken rules. One evening, after settling the children into bed, she wandered down a corridor she rarely passed through. The air was heavier here, the lighting dimmer. As she moved along the long stretch of dark wood-paneled walls, her eyes landed on a door at the very end. It was different. The others had polished brass handles. This one had an old iron lock, its edges slightly rusted with time. Instinct whispered that this was a place she wasn't meant to find. Sarah's fingers grazed the handle, testing it. Locked. Before she could linger, voices drifted from a nearby room. She recognized them immediately. Ambrose. Julius. She knew better than to eavesdrop. But when she heard her own last name, she froze. Hayes. Julius's voice carried a note of warning. You need to be careful, Ambrose. You know what happened before. A pause. Then, Ambrose spoke, his voice lower, rougher. She doesn't know anything. Sarah's stomach tightened. Who? Me? My father? Julius sighed. And if she finds out? What then? Silence. A heavy silence that felt dangerous. Finally, Ambrose responded, voice laced with something unreadable. She won't. Sarah took a step back, heart pounding. What was she not supposed to know? She turned swiftly, heading back the way she came, her pulse hammering in her ears. There was something in this house, something hidden, and it had to do with her family. And now, she knew exactly where to start looking. The locked study. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into something much bigger than herself. The locked study, the whispered conversations, her name on Ambrose's lips. It all formed a puzzle with missing pieces, and she was determined to find them. But she wasn't the only one paying attention. She felt it first in subtle ways. Ambrose watching her, his gaze lingering for a second too long whenever they crossed paths. His presence seemed to appear when she least expected it, like a shadow that never fully disappeared. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe he knew something about her father, and it weighed on him. But as the days passed, his presence became impossible to ignore. One evening, after putting Alara to sleep, she walked into the dimly lit hallway only to find him standing there, arms crossed, waiting. You've been wandering. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Sarah stiffened. I live here now. Am I not allowed to walk in my own home? Ambrose took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. It's not your home. Something in his tone struck a nerve. Maybe not, she admitted, lifting her chin, meeting his gaze without fear. But that doesn't mean I don't belong here. His jaw tensed. You ask too many questions, Miss Hayes. She folded her arms. And you don't give enough answers, Mr. Lancaster. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick, charged with something tense and unspoken. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to decide just how much she knew. Stay out of things that don't concern you, he said finally. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm here for the children. Nothing more. He exhaled, but there was something unreadable in his gaze, something that looked dangerously close to frustration, or something else entirely. Good, he muttered. Then keep it that way. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Sarah stood there, fists clenched at her sides, heart hammering. She had just made a mistake, not by asking questions, but by letting Ambrose see how much she wanted the answers. The phone call came in the middle of the afternoon. Sarah had just finished tidying up the playroom when Margaret appeared in the doorway, looking more hurried than usual. There's been an accident at Finn's school, she said. Mr. Lancaster is already on his way. You should go too. Sarah barely heard the rest. Her mind raced as she grabbed her coat and rushed outside. By the time she arrived at the hospital, she spotted Ambrose near the reception desk. Even in his pristine suit, there was an unusual stiffness to his posture, like he wasn't used to feeling helpless. His gaze snapped to her the moment she entered. What happened? She asked, breathless. Some reckless boy pushed him on the stairs, Ambrose said, his voice tight. The school said he hit his arm hard enough to need an X-ray, Sarah's chest clenched. Is he in pain? Ambrose exhaled through his nose. I don't know. They haven't let me see him yet. Before she could respond, a nurse appeared. You can go in now. They both moved at the same time. The hospital room was small, sterile, and Finn lay on the bed, his arm wrapped in a temporary sling. His expression was calm but guarded, as if trying not to let anyone see how much it hurt. Finn, Ambrose said, striding over. How bad is it? Finn shrugged with his good arm. Not too bad. Just a small fracture. The doctor says I'll have a cast for a few weeks. Sarah approached the other side of the bed, offering a reassuring smile. Sounds like you'll get everyone to sign it. That's the fun part, right? For the first time that day, Finn's lips twitched into something close to a smile. But Ambrose remained tense. This shouldn't have happened, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Finn sighed. Dad, it's not like I fell off a building. I'll be fine. Sarah glanced between them. She could feel the frustration radiating from Ambrose, the tight coil of emotions he clearly didn't know how to express. Ambrose, she said softly, drawing his attention. He's okay. It was a simple statement, but something in her voice must have cut through his guarded exterior, because he finally exhaled, some of the tension draining from his shoulders. For a moment, their eyes locked, not in challenge, not in conflict, but in quiet understanding. Sarah wasn't sure what passed between them in that second, but it felt like a shift, a crack in the ice. Then Finn yawned dramatically. You guys are making it weird. Sarah laughed, and to her surprise, Ambrose's lips twitched as if he was fighting a smile. And just like that, the walls between them weren't gone, but they were no longer unbreakable. Sarah had never attended an event like this before. The Lancaster Charity Gala was an annual affair, an evening of wealth and influence where high society gathered under dazzling chandeliers, sipping champagne and making deals disguised as small talk. She had only been meant to drop off the children. Finn and Alara had been invited to attend, and Margaret had made it clear that Sarah's job was to ensure they arrived safely. But when they stepped into the grand ballroom, plans changed instantly. We have a problem, Ambrose said, appearing beside her in a perfectly tailored black suit. Sarah straightened, caught off guard by how effortlessly he blended into this world. Powerful, unreadable. What kind of problem? She asked. Their usual chaperone isn't here, and I can't leave them alone, he said, his tone edged with irritation, though not at her. She frowned. So, you stay. Sarah blinked. Excuse me? Ambrose exhaled sharply, like he already regretted saying it. For tonight, you're not the nanny. You're their guardian. Just try to blend in. Sarah glanced down at her simple black dress, nothing like the extravagant gowns the other women wore. Right, she muttered, because I fit in so well here. But Ambrose had already turned, leading the children into the ballroom. For the first hour, she tried to stay in the background, watching as Ambrose navigated the room with ease, exchanging handshakes and cool, practiced smiles. And then, the music changed. A slow, classical melody filled the space as couples began stepping onto the dance floor. Sarah had just started backing toward the exit when a voice stopped her. You're not hiding, are you? She turned to find Ambrose watching her, his expression unreadable. Just avoiding disaster, she said lightly. I'm not exactly gala material. Ambrose tilted his head slightly. You're here. That's enough. Before she could process what was happening, he extended a hand. The air between them shifted. She hesitated. I don't think this is a good idea. Neither do I, he admitted. But we're doing it anyway. The second she placed her hand in his, a warmth spread through her fingers. He led her onto the dance floor with a quiet confidence, one hand settling against her waist, the other holding hers just firmly enough to make her heart stumble. Their movements were slow, measured, but the awareness between them was anything but. She felt the strength beneath his touch. She heard the way his breath hitched when she moved closer. Their eyes met, just for a second, but it was enough. Sarah wasn't sure who pulled away first, but the moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. And yet, as Ambrose stepped back, his fingers trailing from hers, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. The weight of unanswered questions had been pressing on Sarah's chest for weeks. Every passing day inside the Lancaster mansion only confirmed what she already knew deep down. There were secrets in this house. Secrets that, somehow, connected to her. And now, she was ready to find them. She sat cross-legged on the rug in her bedroom, papers scattered across the floor. Old newspaper clippings, legal documents she had managed to dig up, anything with the name Hayes attached to it. Her father's disappearance had never made headlines. It had never even been treated as suspicious. Just another man who had vanished, another story lost in the city. But then she found it. A business contract dated the year her father disappeared, and stamped at the bottom, Lancaster Industries. Her stomach twisted. He had worked for them. The truth was right there, staring at her, and yet it made no sense. If her father had been involved with the Lancaster Empire, why had no one ever spoken about it? Why was there no trace of him in the company's records? Unless someone had erased him. The thought sent a chill down her spine. And then came Daphne Wallace. The charity gala had just begun to fade into memory, but the presence of Ambrose's former business partner lingered like a shadow. Sarah had only heard whispers about Daphne. Once one of the most influential women in the Lancaster Empire, she had been pushed out years ago after a very public legal battle. Now, she was back, and she had questions of her own. Sarah found her standing by the grand staircase one evening, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the room with sharp eyes. "You must be the new nanny," Daphne said smoothly before Sarah could slip away. There was something too knowing in her gaze. Sarah hesitated. "And you are?" A slow, deliberate smile. Someone who knows what happens to people who get too close to Lancaster secrets. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she held her ground. "Then maybe you can tell me why my father's name is connected to Ambrose's company." Daphne's smirk vanished. For the first time, she looked genuinely surprised, and something else, something dangerously close to amusement. "Oh," she murmured, tilting her head. "So you really don't know." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. Daphne leaned in slightly. "I suggest you stop digging, dear." "Because the truth?" Her lips curved into a knowing smirk. "It won't set you free." She walked away before Sarah could say another word. And just like that, the ground beneath her felt unsteady. Because Daphne Wallace knew something. And now, Sarah had no choice but to find out what. The storm outside had nothing on the tension inside. Sarah had pushed too far, and she knew it. But there was no going back now. The confrontation had escalated. Accusations, questions, and the unrelenting pull of something neither of them wanted to name. They stood in the dim glow of Ambrose's office, the air thick with anger, frustration, and something even more dangerous, undeniable attraction. "Why won't you just tell me the truth?" Sarah's voice was raw, edged with frustration. She had spent weeks circling the same unanswered questions, feeling the walls close in around her. Ambrose stood across from her, his shoulders tense, his hands braced against the desk as if he needed something solid to hold on to. His control, the carefully built mask of indifference, was cracking. "Because it won't change anything," he snapped, his voice rough, almost desperate. Sarah took a step closer. "It will change everything." For the first time, his gaze wavered. She saw it, the hesitation, the war inside him. He was keeping something from her, but more than that, he was afraid of what would happen if he let her in. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the sharp lines of his face. God, he looked tired. Tired of the lies, of the weight he carried, of the distance he had forced between them. "Ambrose," she said, softer now, stepping into his space. "You don't have to do this alone." His jaw tightened, his breathing uneven. He should have moved, should have told her to leave, should have put a wall between them, like he always did. But he didn't. Instead, his hand brushed against her arm, barely touching, but enough to set fire to every nerve in her body. Sarah inhaled sharply, and for one charged moment, the world narrowed down to this. To the way his fingers lingered, to the way his chest rose and fell unsteadily, to the way his eyes flickered to her lips. Just once, just long enough to break every rule they'd been trying to follow. And then, he kissed her. Or maybe she kissed him. She wasn't sure who moved first, only that suddenly, his hands were on her waist, pulling her closer, and her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt as if letting go was no longer an option. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was heat and desperation and the weight of everything they weren't saying. But then, he stopped. Just as suddenly as it had started, Ambrose ripped himself away, breathing hard, his expression torn between regret and something darker. "This can't happen," he muttered, stepping back like he needed the distance to breathe. Sarah's heart was hammering, her lips still tingling from the ghost of his touch. "Then why did you let it?" For a long, stretched moment, he didn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, "Because I don't know how to stop." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Sarah alone in the dark, with nothing but the memory of his lips on hers and the realization that this, whatever this was far from over. The air in the Lancaster mansion had changed. It wasn't something obvious. No spoken words, no dramatic shifts. But it was there, a silent weight between them, pressing against every stolen glance, every moment they found themselves alone. Sarah felt it in the way Ambrose avoided her. Not in the physical sense. He was still present, still hovering like a storm on the horizon. But something in him had locked up even tighter than before. He was retreating, and that only made her want to push harder. The morning after the kiss, Sarah tried to act normal. Tried. At breakfast, she sat across from Finn and Alara, pretending not to feel Ambrose's presence lingering in the background. Alara, as always, was full of chatter. "Miss Sarah, can we go to the park today?" Finn snorted. "In this weather? It's freezing." "We can bundle up," Alara insisted. "Right, Miss Sarah?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Ambrose beat her to it. "No," he said, his voice sharp and unexpectedly final. Everyone turned. Even Finn looked surprised. Alara frowned. "Why not?" Ambrose's expression barely changed, but Sarah saw it. The flicker of something restless beneath his calm exterior. "It's not safe." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "It's a park, Ambrose. Not a war zone." His gaze snapped to hers. There it was again. That unspoken tension. "This isn't up for debate," he said smoothly, but there was an edge to his voice. Finn folded his arms. "Since when do you care what we do?" Sarah saw it. The way that single sentence hit its mark. The way Ambrose's fingers tensed against the edge of the table. But instead of responding, he simply stood. "I have a meeting. We'll talk later." He left before anyone could say another word. Sarah clenched her jaw. What the hell was he doing? He was pulling away, closing himself off. And worse, he was starting to protect her in ways she didn't ask for. That night, as she walked down the hallway, she wasn't surprised when she found him waiting. Ambrose stood near the window, his hands in his pockets, his gaze on the darkened sky. "You need to stop asking questions," he said without turning around. Sarah exhaled. "And you need to stop avoiding answers." Finally, he faced her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes? Not so much. "I'm keeping you safe," he said. Sarah took a step closer, her pulse unsteady. "From what?" Ambrose hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. Something was coming, and it wasn't just about her father anymore. Some truths hide in shadows, waiting for the right moment to shatter everything. Sarah hadn't expected to find it that night. She had only intended to look. Just one more clue, one more step toward the truth. But what she found wasn't just a missing puzzle piece. It was the entire picture, and it changed everything. It was late. The mansion was silent except for the occasional creak of wood settling in the cold. Sarah stood in Ambrose's office, heart pounding, hands trembling over the stack of old documents she had just uncovered. They weren't hidden behind some locked door. No, they had been sitting in plain sight, tucked into an old leather-bound ledger, collecting dust on the shelf. Overlooked, forgotten, but not meaningless. She flipped through the pages, scanning name after name, until she found it. Hayes. Her breath caught. The entry was old, nearly 20 years ago, but there was no mistaking it. Her father had worked for Lancaster Industries, not just as an employee, as a trusted associate. And then, suspicious activity. A scandal. something buried before it could reach the public. And right at the center of it, Ambrose's father. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, nausea curling in her stomach. This was it. This was why no one had ever given her answers. Her father hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased. A presence filled the doorway. She knew who it was before she even turned. Ambrose. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, there was something there. Something dark. Slowly, he stepped inside. "What are you doing?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "You knew." His brows furrowed. "Knew what?" She turned the ledger toward him, her fingers gripping the edge like it might disintegrate in her hands. "My father. His name is here. In your family's records." Ambrose's gaze flicked down. He scanned the page, his face carefully neutral. But then she saw it. The moment it hit him, his fingers clenched, his jaw tightened like steel. His body went rigid. "No," he muttered. "That's not possible." Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is." Ambrose took a step back. He ran a hand through his hair, the cracks in his carefully controlled demeanor starting to show. "My father," he exhaled, almost like he couldn't breathe. "I knew he wasn't clean, but this," his voice cut off, as if saying it out loud made it real. Sarah's chest ached. She wanted to hate him, wanted to blame him, but the way he looked at her now, like the ground had just collapsed beneath his feet, told her one thing. Ambrose Lancaster hadn't known, and now that he did, he would never be the same. The storm didn't come with rain or thunder. It came with headlines, with flashing cameras, with whispered accusations that turned into shouted demands for the truth. It came with Daphne Wallace, standing before the world, holding a loaded gun. And that gun was Ambrose Lancaster's past. The news broke in the early hours of the morning. Sarah had barely slept, the weight of the previous night still pressing against her chest. The revelation about her father, the way Ambrose had unraveled before her eyes, the raw pain in his voice as he realized his family had never been as untouchable as he believed. It was all still fresh. She had wanted to talk to him, to tell him they could figure it out together. But when she reached the bottom of the staircase, the entire mansion was already awake. Margaret was at the door, her face pale as she listened to someone over the phone. Staff moved in hurried whispers. The security team was on high alert. And then she heard it. The TV. Her stomach dropped as she turned toward the sound. On screen, Daphne Wallace stood before a sea of reporters, her expression one of carefully calculated devastation. "I remained silent for years," she said, voice steady, measured. "A performance meant to destroy. But I can't stand by any longer and watch the truth be buried." Sarah's breath caught. The Lancaster Empire was built on deception, Daphne continued. Shady dealings, erased histories, people who suddenly disappeared. She let that word hang, knowing exactly what it would suggest. She didn't say Sarah's father's name. She didn't have to, because she had planted the seed, and now it would grow into something Ambrose could never outrun. When Sarah found him, he was already shutting down. His office was in disarray, papers scattered, the phone ringing over and over again. But Ambrose stood by the window, still as stone, watching the cameras gather outside the estate. "They'll tear you apart," Sarah said, voice barely above a whisper. Ambrose didn't turn. "I deserve it." "No," she said immediately. "This isn't on you. It's on your father." Finally, he looked at her, and what she saw there broke her. Defeat, guilt, and something even worse, the quiet decision of a man who had already made up his mind. "You need to leave, Sarah." Her chest tightened. "What?" "I should never have let you get this close," he said. "I should never have touched you." The words cut deeper than they should have. But Sarah wasn't letting him do this. "You don't get to push me away," she shot back. "Not after everything." "Go." A command. A plea. But she didn't move. Because the only thing worse than watching Ambrose fall apart was knowing he wanted to do it alone. Some storms shatter the world in a single strike. Others creep in quietly until the damage is already done. Finn had been watching, waiting, and tonight, he decided he had seen enough. No one noticed he was gone at first. The house had been in chaos since Daphne's accusations hit the media. Security had been doubled. The staff moved like ghosts, avoiding Ambrose's sharp, distant silence. But Sarah noticed. She had checked Finn's room just before dinner, expecting to find him buried in a book like always. Instead, she found an open window and a missing coat. Her chest tightened. She rushed downstairs, heart pounding as she found Ambrose standing in the dimly lit office, staring at nothing. "He's gone." The words hit him like a gunshot. Ambrose turned sharply, confusion flickering before the realization set in. "What do you mean, gone?" "He ran," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And if we don't find him fast, we—" But Ambrose was already grabbing his coat, and for the first time in days, the fire was back in his eyes. The storm outside wasn't just metaphorical. It was cold, the wind sharp as they searched the empty streets. Sarah's mind raced. Where would he go? What would Finn do? Then, suddenly, she knew. She turned to Ambrose, breathless. "I think I know where he is." And before he could ask how, she ran. She found Finn on the edge of the city, sitting on a park bench, knees pulled to his chest. His face was pale from the cold, his fingers trembling, but his expression was hard. Sarah slowed as she approached, careful, because he was on the edge of something, and she knew what that felt like. "Finn," she said softly, "it's freezing out here." He didn't look up. "I don't care." Sarah exhaled, stepping closer. "I know why you ran." His fingers curled into his sleeves. "Then you know why I'm not going back." Sarah knelt beside him, her heart aching. "Your dad is scared," she said gently. "Not of what's happening, but of losing you." Finn's jaw tightened. "Then why is he pushing us away?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Because he thinks he's protecting you. Because he doesn't know how to love without hurting." "Instead," she said, "because he doesn't know how to fight for himself." Finally, Finn looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, he let the cracks show. "You promise he still cares?" he whispered. Sarah reached for his hand. "I promise." And when Ambrose arrived, breathless, desperate, his walls finally broke too. Because Sarah had brought his son home. Some battles are fought with words, others with silence. And then there are the battles fought within. The ones that tear a person apart before they finally surrender. Tonight, Ambrose Lancaster surrendered. The house was quiet when they returned. Finn had fallen asleep almost instantly, exhaustion pulling him under the moment he was safely tucked into bed. Sarah had stayed with him for a while, brushing his hair back as he mumbled in his sleep. But now, as she walked down the hall toward her own room, she felt him before she saw him. Ambrose. He stood at the far end of the hallway, leaning against the wall, his posture defeated. The man who had always been controlled, untouchable, armored against the world. He looked different now. His tie was undone. His hands were in his pockets, and his eyes found hers instantly, like he had been waiting for her to look. Sarah stopped. Neither of them spoke, and yet the air between them shifted, heavy with something neither could ignore. Finally, Ambrose exhaled, running a hand down his face. "I can't keep doing this," he murmured. Sarah's heart stumbled. "Doing what?" He pushed off the wall, taking slow steps toward her. "Pushing you away," he admitted. "Pretending you don't matter." She swallowed, her throat tight. "You don't have to." His jaw tensed, his breath uneven. "Sarah, he hesitated, but not out of doubt, out of fear. And then, finally, he broke. With a quiet curse, he closed the distance between them, his hand cupping her face, pulling her in like she was the only thing keeping him upright. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't planned. It was desperation and relief, heat and surrender. Sarah felt it. The way he held her like he was afraid she'd disappear. The way his fingers curled into her waist, grounding himself. She let herself fall. Into him. Into this. Into everything they had been running from. By the time they broke apart, their breathing was uneven, their foreheads resting against each other. Ambrose's hands lingered at her waist, like he wasn't ready to let go. "I need you," he whispered. Sarah pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. "Then stop fighting it." His eyes searched hers, something raw, something real breaking through. And then, for the first time, Ambrose Lancaster let himself believe in love. Some people run from the fire. Others stand in the flames, letting them consume everything weak, everything false, until only the truth remains. Ambrose Lancaster had spent his entire life avoiding fire. But tonight, for the first time, he was ready to fight back. The morning after everything changed, the mansion was quieter than usual. Not the eerie, suffocating silence it once held, but a silence that felt like the moment before a storm, when the air charged with something inevitable. Sarah sat at the kitchen island, stirring a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. Across from her, Ambrose stood near the window, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his jaw tight as he scrolled through the news on his phone. Daphne's accusations had spread like wildfire. Every headline twisted the knife deeper. Lancaster empire crumbling? Former partner reveals the truth about Ambrose Lancaster. Secrets of the Lancaster legacy. How far does the corruption go? Sarah watched him carefully. The old Ambrose would have buried himself in denial, pushed away anyone who tried to help. But this man, the one standing before her now, looked like he was done running. Finally, he put his phone down. "We fight," he said simply. Sarah lifted a brow. "Just like that?" His lips twitched. "Just like that." She folded her arms, studying him. "And how exactly do we fight an entire media circus?" Ambrose leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter, his gaze locked onto hers. "We take away their power." Sarah tilted her head. "How?" He exhaled. "They're feeding on speculation. Secrets. We control the story. We tell the truth, on our terms." Sarah's heart stumbled, not because of the plan, but because this was a different man from the one she had met weeks ago. This Ambrose wasn't just reacting. He was choosing to stand, choosing to trust her, choosing to fight. Sarah smiled softly. "I like this side of you." He smirked. "I think you bring it out of me." She shook her head, warmth curling in her chest. Then, more seriously, she asked, "Are you sure? Once you open this door, you can't close it." Ambrose's expression didn't waver. "I'm sure." And for the first time, Sarah believed him. Because this wasn't just about saving a name. It was about reclaiming his life. And this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Every war has a final battle. Every storm has an eye. A moment of eerie stillness before the last, most brutal strike. Sarah had spent weeks uncovering pieces of a puzzle she was never meant to see. But now, she stood at the edge of something bigger than she ever imagined. And Julius McCall held the last piece. She found him in his office downtown, a place that reeked of power, dark wood, polished shelves filled with legal books, and the unmistakable scent of expensive cologne. Julius was expecting her. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, his usual mask of cold calculation firmly in place. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking." Sarah didn't bother with pleasantries. "You have something that belongs to Ambrose." Julius smirked. "I have a lot of things that belong to Ambrose." Sarah's nails dug into her palm, but she kept her voice even. "The documents. The ones that prove his father was behind the scandal." Julius leaned back in his chair, watching her the way a predator watches prey. "And why should I hand those over?" Sarah's pulse was steady, but her mind raced. This was it, the moment that changed everything. She stepped closer, keeping her voice calm, controlled, dangerous in its certainty. "Because you don't want to go down with him." For the first time, Julius's smirk faltered. Sarah didn't stop. "You've spent your career cleaning up Lancaster messes," she continued. "But Ambrose isn't his father. He's not going to cover this up. He's going to expose it." Julius chuckled, but there was something forced about it. "You think he has that kind of power?" Sarah smiled. "No, I think I do." Julius's expression darkened. Sarah pressed forward. "You're a smart man, Julius. You know when to jump ship. So let me make this easy for you. Either you hand over those documents and walk away with your career intact, or you go down with the man who actually orchestrated all of this." Silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched between them like a taut rope. Then, finally, Julius exhaled, resigned, defeated. He opened a drawer, pulled out a slim folder, and slid it across the desk. Sarah picked it up, flipping through the contents. There it was. Everything. The proof that Ambrose was never guilty. She looked up at Julius, holding his gaze. You made the right choice. Julius's jaw tightened. We'll see. Sarah turned, gripping the folder like a lifeline. Because this wasn't just about clearing Ambrose's name. This was about ending the legacy of lies that had haunted them both. And now, it was finally over. The truth isn't always a weapon. Sometimes it's a reckoning, a force that crashes through lies and deceit, leaving only what was always meant to stand. Sarah had delivered the final blow. Now, it was time to watch the empire of lies crumble. The press conference was held in the Lancaster Building's Grand Hall, the same place where, just weeks ago, Ambrose had stood alone, watching his legacy burn under the weight of accusations. But today was different. Today, he had the truth on his side. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the anticipation of scandal. Ambrose stepped forward, his presence as commanding as ever. But there was something new in his stance. Conviction, unshakable and unwavering. Sarah stood in the crowd, her fingers curled around the edge of the folder. The folder that held Julius's betrayal, his manipulation, the proof that Ambrose had been nothing more than a pawn in his father's sins. Ambrose's voice was steady, clear, and sharp as a blade. For weeks, my name has been dragged through speculation and deceit. But today, the truth speaks for itself. He nodded to his assistant, who distributed copies of the documents to the media. Screens behind him flickered to life, displaying undeniable evidence. The room erupted. Headlines were rewritten in real time. Ambrose Lancaster cleared. The real mastermind revealed. Julius McCall exposed. A career built on lies. Julius had thought himself untouchable. Now, he was cornered, surrounded by a press that had once respected him, now turning on him like wolves sensing weakness. But it wasn't over. Because while Julius had manipulated and deceived, there was someone who had done worse. Someone who had wanted not just Ambrose's downfall, but his destruction. Daphne Wallace. The moment the press turned their attention to her, she knew. She had lost. Security descended before she could slip away. Officers pushed through the crowd, their arrival swift, decisive. Sarah watched as Daphne's carefully constructed facade shattered. You can't do this. Daphne hissed, her voice sharp, desperate. I exposed the truth. Ambrose's gaze was like ice. No, he said, his voice deadly calm. You twisted it. She struggled against the officers, but there was no escaping this. Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding, her pulse roaring in her ears. Daphne's gaze snapped to hers, eyes filled with something dark, something unrepentant. You have no idea what you've done, she sneered. But Sarah only tilted her head, voice steady. Neither do you. And then, Daphne Wallace, once a powerful figure in the Lancaster Empire, was led away in handcuffs, her legacy reduced to nothing but ashes. As the press exploded with the fallout, Sarah felt a warm hand on hers. Ambrose. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Because this fight was over. And they had won. Power. Wealth. Legacy. For years, these were the pillars of Ambrose Lancaster's life. They had defined him, shaped him, trapped him. And now, he was ready to let them go. The office was eerily quiet, the once imposing space now stripped of the power it used to hold. Ambrose stood near the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the skyline. A city he had once ruled, now nothing more than a view. Behind him, Sarah watched the weight of his decisions settle onto his shoulders. She had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. You don't have to do this. Sarah's voice was soft, but firm, cutting through the silence like a whispered plea. Ambrose didn't turn, his gaze still fixed on the world he was about to leave behind. Yes, he said quietly. I do. She stepped forward, hesitant, her heart pounding. This company, it's your life? At that, he finally turned to face her. His expression was calm, but his eyes, they burned with something raw, something unshakable. No, he murmured. It was my father's life. His choices. his corruption, his mess. He exhaled, shaking his head. And I let it define me for too long. Sarah's chest tightened. She had seen Ambrose fight tooth and nail to clear his name. She had seen him break, unravel, fall apart under the weight of it all. And now he was walking away. He reached for the papers on his desk, his final act as Lancaster's CEO. A resignation. A goodbye. She swallowed hard. What will you do now? Ambrose looked at her, something soft, almost peaceful in his gaze. Start over. 2 simple words. And yet, they held everything. The news broke within the hour. Ambrose Lancaster steps down. A new era begins. The media spun it as a shocking fall from power, but Sarah knew the truth. This wasn't a fall. It was a choice. That night, as the world buzzed about the Lancaster dynasty's unexpected shift, Sarah found Ambrose in the library, a drink in hand, but no tension in his posture for the first time in weeks. She stood in the doorway, watching him, her heart full and aching all at once. You really did it, she whispered. Ambrose glanced up, his lips curving into something real, something unburdened. I did. Sarah stepped closer. Are you okay? He tilted his head, considering the question. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. I think, for the first time in my life, I am. And when she reached for him, he didn't hesitate. Because for the first time, he had nothing to lose, and everything to gain. Some things fade. Money, power, legacies built on sand. But love? Love remains. The Lancaster mansion was no longer a place of power. It was just a house now, a hollow shell of what it once was. Ambrose stood in the grand hall, gazing at the emptiness, at the echoes of a life he no longer belonged to. The staff had left. The business was no longer his concern. The world that had once defined him had moved on. But one thing remained, and she was standing right in front of him. Sarah had planned to leave, not because she wanted to, but because she thought he needed space to rebuild, to find himself without her shadow looming over him. She had packed her bags that morning, told herself that it was the right thing to do. But as she stood there now, watching Ambrose, the man who had once been nothing but cold edges and unspoken grief, she realized something. She didn't want to go. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want her to either. I should go, she said softly, gripping the handle of her bag. Ambrose's jaw tightened. No, you shouldn't. Her breath caught. Ambrose, you think I need to figure things out on my own, he interrupted, stepping closer, his eyes locked onto hers. But what if I don't want to? Sarah swallowed. This is your chance to start fresh. Ambrose exhaled, his fingers twitching at his sides, like he was holding back something he could no longer contain. I don't want to start fresh without you. The words were quiet, but they carried everything. Sarah's heart pounded. Ambrose. His hand found hers, his grip firm, steady. Real. I don't have a last name that carries weight anymore, he murmured. I don't have an empire. I don't have anything. She shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. That's not true. Ambrose let out a slow breath. I have you. And then, finally, he asked the question he should have asked from the beginning. Stay. A single word. A simple request. But it was the first thing Ambrose had ever truly chosen for himself. Sarah looked up at him, at the man who had fought so hard to push her away, only to realize she was the one thing he never wanted to lose. She dropped her back, and as Ambrose pulled her into his arms, she whispered the only answer that had ever made sense. Always, because power fades, but love remains. Some endings feel like loss. Others feel like freedom. Ambrose Lancaster had spent his entire life chasing legacy, power, control, things he once believed would make him untouchable. But here, now, standing in the doorway of a house that wasn't built on power but on choice, he realized something. This wasn't the end of his story. This was the first page of something new. The house was nothing like the Lancaster estate. It wasn't grand, wasn't laced with history or wealth. There were no towering ceilings, no marble floors, no staff waiting at the door. It was warm, though. Sunlight spilled through wide-open windows, the scent of fresh wood and morning coffee filling the air. It was a home, and it was theirs. Sarah stood in the kitchen, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear as she unpacked the last of the dishes. It was strange how quickly she had fallen in love with the simplicity of this life. No headlines, no security teams, no whispers of scandal in every corner. Just quiet mornings and the sound of laughter spilling from the backyard. She heard footsteps behind her and turned just in time to see Ambrose leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with something soft in his eyes. "You're staring," she teased, raising an eyebrow. He smirked. "I like what I see." Her heart stumbled, even after everything they'd been through. "Flattery won't get you out of helping me unpack." He shrugged, pushing off the doorway and stepping closer. "What if I had something better in mind?" Sarah rolled her eyes, but she couldn't stop smiling. Outside, Finn and Alara ran across the grass, their laughter ringing through the air as they chased each other beneath the golden sky. It was something Ambrose had never imagined for them. This kind of childhood, one untouched by the weight of the Lancaster name. Finn caught sight of him and smirked. "You're actually smiling, Dad. Should I be worried?" Ambrose scoffed, shaking his head. "Smart-mouthed like your mother." Finn grinned, and Sarah shot Ambrose a look. "I'm not his mother." Ambrose's expression didn't falter. "Not yet." Sarah froze, her pulse skipping. But before she could say anything, Alara tackled her waist, giggling. "This is the best house ever." Alara beamed, wrapping her arms around Sarah. "We finally have a home." Sarah's heart squeezed, her throat tightening as she hugged the little girl back. Because Alara was right. This wasn't just a house. It was everything they never had before. Ambrose's fingers brushed against hers. A quiet promise, a silent vow. He had given up power, fortune, a name that once meant everything. And yet, standing here, watching the people he loved more than anything in the world, he realized he had never been richer. The past has a way of lingering. It sits in the shadows, whispering doubts, reminding you of what was lost, of what was stolen. For years, Sarah had been haunted by a single question. What really happened to her father? She had searched, uncovered fragments of truth, but the picture had never been whole. There had always been a missing piece, something just out of reach. Until now. Tonight, she would finally find the answer. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, untouched, yet heavy as stone. Sarah stared at it, heart pounding, fingers twitching against the sealed edge. Ambrose sat across from her, watching, waiting. Julius had given this to her before disappearing from their lives for good. The final piece of the puzzle, her father's case file, hidden away for decades. Her stomach twisted. For so long, she had wanted this. But now that it was here, "What if it's worse than I imagined?" she whispered, more to herself than him. Ambrose reached across the table, his fingers brushing over hers. "Then we face it. Together." The word "together" was what made her finally move. With a deep breath, she broke the seal. The file was thin, but its contents were enough to shatter everything she once believed. Her father, Matthew Hayes, hadn't run away. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been silenced. Not by Ambrose's father directly, but by the people he had trusted, people who had used him as a scapegoat, knowing he was loyal enough to take the fall. He had planned to fight, had gathered evidence, had tried to expose the corruption. And then, one night, he was gone. A single note remained in the file. He didn't just disappear. Someone made him. Sarah's breath hitched. Not an accident. Not a choice. A cover-up. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the file shut. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Ambrose was quiet, letting her process it in her own time. Finally, she exhaled. "He didn't leave me," she whispered. It wasn't closure. It wasn't justice. But it was the truth. She had spent her whole life believing she was abandoned, unwanted, forgotten. But she wasn't. She never had been. She belonged. And as she looked up at Ambrose, at the man who had stood by her through every painful discovery, she realized something else. The past didn't define her. She did. And she was done running from it. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments. A glance across a room, a hand brushing against yours, a breath shared in the silence of a morning. For Ambrose, love had never been a choice. It had been something unfamiliar, something dangerous, something he had spent years trying to avoid. Until Sarah. Until the woman who had walked into his life, shattered everything he thought he knew, and somehow, against all odds, stayed. Now, he was ready to do the same. It wasn't some grand event. There were no flashing cameras, no extravagant displays, no audience watching to see if she would say yes. It was just them. A quiet evening, the sky painted in soft oranges and deep blues as they sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sun melt into the horizon. Sarah pulled her legs up onto the chair, stretching with a contented sigh. "You know," she murmured, "this is the first time in my life I haven't been waiting for something to go wrong." Ambrose's chest tightened at that, because he understood. He had spent so long looking over his shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up to him, waiting for the inevitable loss. But not anymore. Not with her. She turned to him, eyes bright, the last bit of sunlight reflecting off her skin. "You're staring," she teased, the same way she always did. Ambrose smirked, but this time, he didn't look away. This time, he let himself feel it. The certainty, the knowing. "Sarah," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Something in his tone made her still, her playful smile fading into something softer, something expectant. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the cool metal of what had been waiting there all night. When he pulled out the ring, her breath caught. No words, no grand speech, just a look, a moment between them where everything else disappeared. Ambrose took her hand, pressing his forehead lightly against hers. "I've spent my life making decisions out of fear," he murmured. "This is the first one I'm making out of love." Sarah's fingers tightened around his, tears slipping down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. Ambrose smiled, his thumb brushing them away. "Marry me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. Sarah let out a breathless laugh, nodding before she could even form words.
"Yes."
His lips crashed into hers, soft but desperate, like he had been holding this moment inside him for far too long. And as he slipped the ring onto her finger, it wasn't just an engagement. It was a life beginning. Together. Always. Some people say love is a risk, that it's unpredictable, fleeting, something that can be lost as easily as it is found. But Ambrose had learned something else. Love isn't a risk. It's a choice. And today, he was making that choice forever. The garden was bathed in golden light, the scent of fresh blooms drifting through the air as the soft hum of music played in the background. It wasn't the kind of wedding expected of a Lancaster. No towering ballroom, no guest list filled with the powerful and the elite, no headlines speculating about what came next. This was intimate. This was theirs. Finn stood off to the side, straightening the cuffs of his suit with a dramatic sigh. "I still don't understand why people cry at weddings." Alara twirled in her little white dress, her curls bouncing. "Because it's romantic, dummy." Finn rolled his eyes. "It's just two people saying words and putting on rings." Alara huffed. "No, it's love." Finn made a face, but Sarah wasn't listening. She stood at the edge of the pathway, heart hammering as she looked ahead, at him. At Ambrose. The man who had once been untouchable, unshakable, wrapped in layers of armor so thick she thought she'd never reach him. Now, he stood there, waiting for her, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Sarah took a breath. This was it, the home she had searched for, the belonging she had never found anywhere else. It had been here all along, with him. The ceremony was simple, filled with quiet laughter, soft words, the warmth of hands held a little too tightly. When the vows came, Ambrose didn't need a script. He took her hands in his thumb brushing over her skin, and just spoke. "I spent most of my life believing love was a weakness," he said, voice steady but thick with something real. "That letting someone in meant losing control. That caring too much would destroy me." He swallowed, his fingers tightening around hers. "But you proved me wrong." Sarah blinked back tears. Ambrose exhaled a quiet laugh. "You walked into my life and tore down every wall I built. And I didn't just let you. I needed you to. Because without you, I was nothing but a man trapped in his past." He lifted her hand to his lips. You are my future, Sarah, and I choose you. Today, tomorrow, always. Sarah let out a soft, shaky laugh. You stole my vows. Ambrose smirked, whispering, say them anyway. And she did. With tears in her eyes and her heart finally whole, she said them. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, it wasn't just a kiss that sealed it. It was a promise, a life, a love that had survived everything. As cheers erupted and Alara giggled, throwing flowers into the air, Ambrose pulled Sarah close, whispering just for her. We made it. She smiled, pressing her forehead against his. We did. And as laughter, love, and the echoes of forever surrounded them, Sarah finally knew. Love doesn't just win. It endures.